He made no mention of the regional approach he had outlined in his March 2009 speech, using U.S. diplomacy to involve Afghanistan's neighbors in a non-interference pact to stabilize the region. He made no mention of reforming U.S. aid and development to Afghanistan. He offered no message to Afghan civil society or the Afghan people. At the United Nations, Obama's surge resulted in greater hostility from members. In January 2010, Kai Ida, the UN Special Representative for Afghanistan, presented a devastating report to the UN Security Council in which he said that the U.S. emphasis on security over social and developmental issues would doom any efforts to stabilize the country. "We will fail," he warned the UN. "What we need is a strategy that is politically and not militarily driven." Civilian deaths had risen by 14% in 2009, he said, compared to the previous year. If these negative trends are not reversed, and reversed soon, there is the danger that the combination of them will become unmanageable. The central government was being weakened, he said, as 80% of all aid was financed directly by Western governments, rather than by Kabul. Ida made it clear that the entire U.S. surge had been put in place in the absence of an overarching political and economic strategy. Ida, whose term in Kabul lasted from 2008 to 2010, was a deeply honest and forthright individual who told the Americans and Karzai the blunt truth. He made it clear that the Americans had never consulted with the UN or with NATO about critical strategy-related questions, while the Afghan authorities had mostly been spectators as the United States formed policy for their country. He was one of the first high-level officials convinced of the need for reconciliation with the Taliban, at a time when that idea was deeply unpopular. And, as with Holbrooke, the Obama administration chose to ignore his messages. Al-Qaeda struck a major blow on December 31, 2009, when it used a Jordanian double agent to inflict the worst-ever casualties on the CIA. The man blew himself up at a U.S. base in the southeastern province of Khost, killing 7 CIA officers and a Jordanian military officer. Then, on January 18, 2010, 12 suicide bombers brazenly tried to occupy shopping plazas and banks in Kabul. It took several hours of heavy fighting before they were all killed. These attacks did not alter the first target of the U.S. surge, which was Marjah, a small farming region in Helmand Province. In mid-February 2010, the Marines began an offensive to clear Marjah. It was not in a populous region. It held a total of just 80,000 people. Nor was it of vital strategic importance. Most Afghans had never heard of it. Helmand had a population of only 1.4 million people, or just 1/30th of Afghanistan's total, but it was a base for the heroin industry, from which the Taliban profited, as well as a major route for supplies and recruits from Pakistan. The Taliban had ruled Helmand unopposed since 1993. After their defeat in 2001, they remained in control of Helmand due to the lack of Western forces being deployed in the province. Finally, in 2006, 8,000 British troops were deployed in Helmand, and heavy fighting broke out with the Taliban, which continues to this day. The U.S. Marine Corps decided to move its forces to Helmand from Iraq, and as I explained earlier, the Marines had an independent command and decision-making structure within the U.S. military. Marjah was more about the Marines showing what they could do than it was part of a strategically defined offensive. Marjah had some strategic value, but because of the paucity of population, it could not be seen as part of the counterinsurgency, which should have focused on the most densely populated areas. Marjah was targeted because the U.S. Marines had already decided to pacify Helmand in 2008 before they were under ISAF command, and not because of an overall strategy set by McChrystal. The Marines carried out a spectacular assault, using dozens of helicopters, and then immediately got bogged down as dug-in Taliban, suicide bombers, and mines took their toll. 3 months later, the 15,000 troops were still unable to secure the region. McChrystal's claim that he had a government in a box trained Afghan officials who would jump in behind the troops and begin to govern and provide services, never materialized. No Afghan wanted to serve in Marjah because it was so insecure. By May, only 200 Taliban were left in Marjah, but they were enough to intimidate the remaining population. 26,000 people had already fled the town. Counterinsurgency against the Taliban was not going to be easy. A total of $19 million in aid money was earmarked for development in Marjah, but only $1.5 million was actually spent. The Americans issued vouchers to farmers that would get them free seed and fertilizer, but the farmers rejected them because they feared Taliban reprisals. The UN and other Western NGOs said they would not deploy in Marjah because the U.S. Army was running the reconstruction and the aid agency's neutrality would be jeopardized. As a result of this debate, the military became its own development organization, a mistake that would get worse over time because it could provide neither sustainability nor longevity for projects. In a special program run by the Pentagon, U.S. commanders in the field were given cash to carry out quick-impact projects in their areas of command so they could influence the local people. For the Commander's Emergency Response Program, a budget of $40 million was initially set aside. By 2008, this had grown to $750 million, and by 2010, it was $1 billion, which is more than the entire revenue of the Karzai government. Nobody was consulted on how these vast, free-flowing funds were to be spent. The money was spent by military personnel without professional experience or knowledge, and without consultations with the relevant Afghans or civilian aid experts, said the UN's Kai Ida. On a visit to Marjah at the end of May, an impatient Marine officer asked McChrystal for more time to oust the Taliban. "This is a bleeding ulcer right now," McChrystal responded. "How many days do you think we have before we run out of support by the international community?" His words resounded in the media and in Washington. The United States still did not have enough forces to saturate the area and evict all the Taliban, nor was there the time to win over the population, as the public in the United States and Europe was impatient for results. In the flat, irrigated lands on both sides of the Helmand River, the Taliban's best weapons were IEDs. Despite a $17 billion U.S. military program to counter them, IEDs' use and lethality had dramatically grown. The ammonium nitrate fertilizer used in the bombs, the trigger mechanisms, and other parts came almost wholly from Pakistan. But despite frequent U.S. appeals, the Pakistanis made no attempt to shut down the manufacturers, even though the Pakistani Taliban's bombs used the same materials and parts. There were a total of 8,159 IED attacks in 2009, compared to just 3,867 in 2008, and 2,677 in 2007. In 2010, the Taliban planted a staggering 14,661 IEDs, double the previous year, which killed some 268 U.S. troops and injured another 3,360. IEDs were now the Taliban's most lethal yet safest weapon. The Taliban knew that the Marines would target Kandahar next, and attempted to destabilize the city with daily bomb blasts. They assassinated senior government officials, murdering 11 in Kandahar in February and March 2010, including the deputy mayor, Azizullah Yarmal, who was shot in the city's main mosque while saying his prayers. UN figures showed that in the spring of 2010, there were, on average, 7 assassinations of public officials every week across the country. But between June and September 2010, the number jumped to 21 a week. Kandahar slid into anarchy, with only 5 out of its 17 districts under government control. Kandahar had a corrupt local government run by the president's brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, who was alleged to be involved in protecting drug traffickers while being on the CIA's payroll and being the government's chief interlocutor with the Taliban. But while he lived, he was a tough and ruthless administrator who held the city together. When he was killed in July 2011, there was a sudden vacuum. Under siege in the south, the Taliban showed they could divert the West's attention by attacking in other parts of the country. They attacked the main U.S. base, Bagram, on May 19th, leaving 12 American soldiers wounded. A day earlier, they attacked the NATO convoy in Kabul, killing 19 people. And in Kunduz, in the far northeast, they attacked a compound housing an American contractor, killing 6 people, including 3 foreigners, in a 5-hour battle. The Taliban were like a balloon. Push them from one side and they would pop out on the other. They had learned the military art of lifting pressure from one region by attacking in another. It was their answer to counterinsurgency. As the Taliban had predicted, coalition forces intended to tackle Kandahar next, devising a strategy that they hoped would alienate people the least, yet still squeeze the insurgents out of the city. By September, 28,000 NATO forces, 10,000 Afghan troops, and 5,000 police were deployed in and around Kandahar, by far the largest military mission so far. Afghan troops were stationed inside the city of 2 million people, while the U.S. Marines set up checkposts on the outskirts. As both civilian and military casualties rose and airstrikes inadvertently killed more civilians than militants, President Karzai became increasingly angry at the coalition forces. His vitriol against NATO became critical and coarse. He urged Obama to review his strategy, saying the war could not be won by fighting in the villages of Afghanistan. It had to be taken over the border to eliminate Taliban sanctuaries in Pakistan. Petraeus launched a media counterblitz, revealing that in a 3-month period between May 8th and August 8th, 2010, American Special Forces had killed 365 Taliban commanders and captured some 1,395 Taliban soldiers in night raids. His message to Karzai was that President Obama had not sent him to Afghanistan to seek a graceful exit for U.S. forces. U.S. costs were also high. In the first 9 months of 2010, the Taliban had killed 323 American soldiers, surpassing the 317 total killed in 2009. Marjah had taken half a year to secure, rather than a few weeks. The Taliban may have been cleared, but how long could the Marines maintain this density of troops in a small area when they were needed elsewhere? In retrospect, it was probably a mistake for U.S. forces to go for the hardest killing fields first, Kandahar and Helmand. At the time, I proposed an alternative military strategy. Give first priority to securing Kabul and its surrounding districts and provinces, where some 1/5 of the population lived. Then secure the major roads linking Afghan cities and the roads to the borders that were also major trade routes. Western and Afghan NGOs and aid agencies were unable to send their staff out of Kabul, even 20 miles to a neighboring province, because of security risks and Taliban ambushes. It was unsafe to travel the critical Kabul-Kandahar highway, where corrupt police, criminal gangs, and Taliban groups ran the checkpoints. NATO-supplied convoys moved under heavy guard with payoffs to the Taliban. Clearing the region around Kabul could have initiated a massive improvement in economic development. Several hundred of Obama's civilian experts who were stranded in Kabul could have been out and about in these provinces. The Taliban held enclaves in provinces around Kabul, such as Logar, Wardak, and Kapisa, from which they could terrorize the largely pro-government population. NATO offered no corresponding security. Moreover, the still weak Afghan army could have been better used to secure these areas, because many of its recruits come from these same provinces. Finally, the first military surge should have been launched not in the south, but in the adjoining eastern provinces, where the Taliban were strong. Their supply routes from Pakistan were significant, and there were large populations to be won over. All these opportunities were lost due to the overwhelming focus on Helmand. By 2011, the crisis in Kabul and the 7 provinces that surround the city had become far worse. Large areas, including towns, were under Taliban control, and development work had come to a standstill. Taliban who were sheltering in these provinces could easily launch sporadic attacks in Kabul, such as the suicide attack on the Intercontinental Hotel in June 2011, which killed 21 people, and the brazen attack on the U.S. Embassy on September 13th, which killed 27 people. Stability in the Afghan heartland had steadily eroded, even though it was pivotal to a successful withdrawal of Western troops. The Taliban were not the only problem. An added destabilizing element, according to an influential report, was the nexus between criminal enterprises, insurgent networks and corrupt political elites, which is undermining Kabul's security and that of the Central Eastern Corridor. Outside Kabul, these networks became in effect a Taliban shadow government and a hallmark of its progress. Shadow governors operated in more than 35 of the 62 districts in the 7 provinces. They ran a parallel government, collected taxes, administered justice, settled disputes, and appointed local leaders, sometimes just a few miles from the outskirts of Kabul. The United States had no plan or troops to combat this steady takeover by the Taliban. Afghans argued that NATO's surge in the south had increased the levels of violence, destabilized the entire country, and given the Taliban a propaganda boost. There was truth in this, especially as the metrics of measuring the success of the surge were so controversial. Who could claim to know for certain if the areas retaken by NATO had been cleared for all time or just temporarily? Petraeus claimed that the Taliban had been driven out of their strongholds and could not return, but other commanders tactfully used the phrase fragile and reversible to describe the South's delicate military balance. Aid workers said the surge had been a failure because it had made a wasteland of once viable villages and agricultural communities. Reports emerged that the Americans had destroyed entire villages after evacuating the population because the villages' homes and streets were so heavily laced with IEDs. Mullah Wakil Ahmed Mutawakil, the former Taliban foreign minister, told me in Kabul, "The Americans tried before with surges and failed, and they will fail again. This war is not just a one-way war. If we are losing troops, so are they. If the Taliban are exhausted, so are they. If they increase their numbers, so will we. But they will wear themselves out. New Taliban recruits are more radical and more enthusiastic to fight." For the United States, the key to an eventual withdrawal lay in the successful buildup of the Afghan Security Forces, ASF, the Army, and the police. After years of going too slowly and providing inadequate funding, as I covered in Descent into Chaos, the coalition was finally bringing the ASF up to speed, in terms of numbers, equipment, training, and mentoring. In 2010, the United States spent $11 billion on the ASF, the largest single-ticket item in the defense budget. The Afghan army reached its first target of 134,000 men in late 2010 and would expand further. The police would eventually number 126,000, although they are less well-trained. By October 2012, the ASF would total 352,000. In 2011, the Americans spent $11.6 billion on the ASF, equipping the Afghan army with armor and vehicles, and in 2012, the U.S. would spend $12.8 billion, after which there would be a rapid drawdown on expenditure. According to projections, by the end of 2012, the Americans would have spent a total of $39 billion building up the ASF. The Afghans claimed that it would cost $6 billion a year to maintain all these forces after 2014, a bill that the Americans would have to pay, as the entire Afghan state income in 2014 would not be more than $3 billion. But worrying downsides naturally affected the ability of the ASF to take on the Taliban. In early 2011, the annual attrition rate from the Afghan army was still a staggering 24%. That is, 1 in 7 newly enlisted soldiers was deserting. 86% of the soldiers were illiterate, and drug-taking was an endemic problem. The police were even worse. In June, 5,000 deserted, or 3% of the army, and there were no punishments for desertion. The real problem was the lack of leadership and the absence of a properly trained officer corps. In the 1980s, when the communist Afghan army fought the Mujahideen, there were similar large-scale desertions by rank-and-file soldiers, but the army held together because it had a corps of dedicated communist Pashtun officers who were well-trained by the Soviets. That Pashtun officer class had now disappeared. Although 80% of army units were now partnered with NATO units, no single Afghan army unit was ready to take full responsibility. The United States started a mass literacy campaign within the army so that soldiers could at least read basic instructions. The Americans were doing all this in the midst of an insurgency and a U.S. surge. By contrast, when the U.S. surge started in Iraq in 2007, the Iraq security forces already numbered 1 million men. In a highly controversial part of the U.S. buildup of security forces, Petraeus insisted on creating Arbaki, or local self-defense forces in the villages. The Kabul government opposed the plan because it would allow warlords and militias to return to the countryside. Petraeus, basing his arguments on the Sons of Iraq program he had run in Iraq, where 100,000 militiamen had been raised, finally won support for his plan from Obama and Karzai. He planned to raise 30,000 men, but the Pashtun rural population was deeply suspicious of the militias. The program essentially put too many ill-disciplined armed men in the field. Moreover, when the Afghan administrative presence in the provinces was so small, there were limits to what the ASF could achieve. The training of an Afghan civil service over the past 10 years was an even worse tale of Western neglect, lack of Afghan interest, and shortage of funds and expertise. There is now a civil service academy turning out bureaucrats, but it will be years before they make a difference. The justice system was equally depleted, so the Taliban were easily able to exercise their own form of justice in the countryside. 117 districts were without a single judge. 10 years on, no government ministry was fully competent to run its budget or organize its personnel or spending program. All the ministries lacked capacity, trained officials, and the ability to handle money. The dependence on foreigners was enormous. In 2011, 300 foreign advisors were still working at the Interior Ministry, costing the U.S. government $36 million a year. Thus, the key question for the Americans before 2014 is not how many Taliban they kill, but whether an Afghan state, army, police, bureaucracy, justice, neglected so badly under Bush, can be enabled to take charge of the country. Moreover, can state functionaries win the trust of a people who have put up with insecurity, corruption, and poor governance for so long? Corruption seems impossible to root out. It is endemic and everywhere. The drug trade, U.S. development contracts, oil and goods transport contracts, Western humanitarian aid, everything generates kickbacks, bribes, and payoffs, often to the Taliban themselves. In 2010, American-trained Afghan prosecutors working in secured anti-corruption courts were ready to try 24 senior Afghan officials for corruption. But the arrest of a presidential aide, who was then freed on the orders of the president himself, scuttled the entire effort. Clearly, Karzai has no interest in curbing corruption. In the summer of 2011, the U.S. domestic economic crisis looms as a far larger problem for Obama than the war in Afghanistan. The American president faces a ballooning deficit, a soaring national debt, a 9% jobless rate, a loss of exports and production, and a housing crisis. So Americans are naturally asking why $120 billion is to be spent in Afghanistan that year, money raised not from extra taxes, but entirely from borrowing, and money that could be better spent at home. Not a single Republican presidential candidate for the 2012 presidential election has endorsed maintaining U.S. troops in Afghanistan. The even more serious economic crisis in Europe stymies many NATO countries' spending on Afghanistan. The crises in Afghanistan and Pakistan are evidently going to be sacrificed on the altar of the U.S. debt. In that case, the faster the United States talks to the Taliban and works out a peaceful settlement that will allow the troops to depart in good order, the better it will be, both for the United States and for the region. Chapter 6. Afghanistan. Talking to the Taliban. On November 28, 2010, a cold Bavarian day, in a well-to-do residential village close to Munich, German diplomat Michael Steiner was celebrating his 61st birthday. But this was no party. Steiner and 2 American officials were meeting face-to-face, for the first time in 10 years, with a senior Taliban envoy, the result of intensive German diplomacy and a personal triumph for Steiner. President Obama himself had cleared the first U.S. contact with the Taliban a few weeks earlier. History might well judge that day as a turning point in the 10-year-long war in Afghanistan, no less momentous than the day the United States began talks with the Vietnamese half a century earlier, or when Britain began secret talks with the Irish Republican Army in 1972. A flamboyant, intellectually aggressive troubleshooter for the German Foreign Ministry, Steiner had earned his negotiating spurs in the Balkan conflict, and in May 2010 had been appointed as Berlin's special envoy for AfPak, the German counterpart to Richard Holbrooke, whom Steiner knew well from the Balkans. After many months of shuttling between capitals and meetings with the Taliban, Steiner and his knowledgeable assistant, Arend Wurf, had brought 2 U.S. officials, Frank Ruggiero from the State Department and a deputy to Holbrooke, and Jeff Hayes from the National Security Council staff, together with the Taliban's Syed Tayyab Agha, in his late 30s, a secretary and long-term aide to Mullah Muhammad Omar. Also present was a prince from Qatar's ruling family, whom the Taliban had asked to be present. The 4-way meeting took place in a safe house belonging to the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, the German intelligence service, in the village where Steiner was born. The BND had cordoned off the area, but there were still spies in the village from various countries that had caught a whiff of the meeting. "If this meeting leaks out, it's dead," Steiner reportedly told the participants. Agha, who spoke English, had flown from Pakistan to Qatar on a Pakistani passport, and from there he had been whisked to Germany in a BND plane. He had worked in Mullah Omar's office in Kandahar in the late 1990s, followed by stints in the Taliban's foreign ministry and its embassy in Pakistan. Since 2001, he had been in exile in Iran and Pakistan, and he had been part of a Taliban delegation that had opened informal talks with the Karzai government in Saudi Arabia in 2008. The need for secrecy was intense because any disclosure could endanger Agha's life. Al-Qaeda or some other spoiler might try to kill him. Even a close ally like Britain's MI6 was not told about the meeting, nor was Pakistan's ISI informed of it. The Americans did not trust it to keep a secret, and Taliban leaders had become highly critical of it as well, saying that the ISI constantly threatened them and their families in Pakistan, even though it supported the Taliban war effort against the Americans. The Pakistanis would not take kindly to being bypassed. In 2009, when the Taliban had tried to talk to Karzai's brother in Kandahar without telling the Pakistanis, the ISI had arrested the Taliban interlocutor, the second-in-command, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, and accused him of being a spy for the Americans. Baradar was arrested in Karachi on February 8, 2010, and disappeared into an ISI safe house jail. The small group spent a total of 11 hours together, 6 of them in concentrated talks. They made no preconditions, assurances, or commitments, and both sides avoided actual negotiations. This was a getting-to-know-you session. At the end, Agha brought up the issue of the prisoners that the Taliban wanted freed, whom the United States was holding in Bagram, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo, Cuba. The Taliban were obsessed with getting their commanders out of jail. Steiner took the visitors on a local sightseeing trip. They were intrigued to see a typical German castle and the village church. When the meeting broke up and Agha left, the adrenaline-pumped participants horsed around. Steiner joked that the meeting should be titled The Birthday Party, a spoof on Harold Pinter's famous play. They were euphoric that the ice with the Taliban had finally been broken. Talking to the Taliban had become the most controversial issue for all sides in the war. Hamid Karzai had promoted the idea as early as 2004 because he understood that a military victory in the conventional sense was not possible as long as the United States continued to underfund the war effort and economic development and allowed Taliban safe havens in Pakistan to go unquestioned. Later, Pakistan wanted talks because it hoped to broker the final deal that would bring the Taliban into a power-sharing agreement and keep India out of a reconstituted Afghanistan. European states with troops in Afghanistan supported the idea as a way to exit Afghanistan faster. But for years, the United States had adamantly opposed talks and continued to equate the Taliban with al-Qaeda, making no distinction between them. By 2009 to 2010, many Afghans and Western diplomats realized that the U.S. military surge was not working, and that the Taliban were growing stronger and spreading into every corner of the country. With the 2008 economic recession, the Europeans could not or would not maintain their troops for long. For the Americans, the cost of the war in Afghanistan $109 billion in 2010 and $120 billion in 2011, was also becoming unsustainable, especially as it was being funded entirely with borrowed money. For some time, the Obama administration was divided between civilian advisers who wanted talks with the Taliban and a quick military exit, and the military, which demanded another year or two of surge. General David Petraeus in particular would consider talks only after the Taliban had been decimated. Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was more open to the idea of talks, but took no steps to encourage Obama to pursue that course. I argued repeatedly, both with Petraeus and with Mullen, that by the time the military got what it wanted with its degrading program, the top Taliban leaders who could lead a negotiation would be dead. Richard Holbrooke was convinced of the need to talk, but he lacked support from anyone in the cabinet. As Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars makes plain, Obama's civilian advisers kept getting outmaneuvered by the generals who demanded ever more troops for Afghanistan, rather than talks with the Taliban. Only after the 2010 Lisbon NATO summit set a time limit for Western troops to be out did the idea of talks become more urgent. Naturally, many Western officials doubted that the Taliban were sincere about talks. The most common belief, and the most pessimistic, was that the Taliban had only to wait for American forces to leave, and then they could seize power in Kabul. So why should they want to talk? But the Taliban leaders had matured considerably since the 1990s. They remained firm that all foreign troops had to leave Afghanistan, and that an Islamic system had to be restored to their country, but on both counts they were more flexible than before. Even though they had received extensive training, funding, and other support from al-Qaeda, both before and after 2001, they had now distanced themselves from it. Unlike other groups, the Afghan Taliban leadership had never sworn an oath of loyalty to al-Qaeda or to Osama bin Laden, nor had they adopted al-Qaeda's global jihad agenda or helped train foreigners to become suicide bombers, as the Pakistani Taliban and their Afghan allies, the network led by Jalaluddin Haqqani, had done. Most senior Taliban I spoke to over the years blamed bin Laden and the Arabs for their defeat by the Americans in 2001. The Taliban stressed that they considered themselves Afghan nationalists, not global jihadists. At the death of bin Laden, the Taliban statements remained circumspect, refusing to eulogize him or call for revenge attacks. The Taliban had mellowed on the issues of girls' education, the media, and health services for women, compared with the policies they pursued in the 1990s. In March 2010, Mullah Omar issued a decree banning attacks on all schools, including girls' schools, which did not stop them completely, but much reduced them. The Taliban no longer opposed girls' schools, as long as they were separate from boys' schools, and Taliban shadow governors across the country reassured NGOs that they could build schools. Even though 400 government schools remained closed in the southern war zones, 100 new schools opened in Helmand and Kandahar in 2010 to 2011. In 2011, 8.3 million children started the new school year in Afghanistan, 40% of them girls, up from 7.6 million in the previous year. The Taliban had partially adhered to a UN Peace Day on September 23, 2008, when Taliban attacks dropped by 70%. They had allowed the UN to conduct a medical campaign to immunize children against polio in many war-torn areas, and mid-level Taliban commanders had held meetings with UN officials in Kabul and other cities, where they talked of the need for local confidence-building measures, such as ceasefires. The UN Special Representative Kai Ida encouraged all these efforts, in particular, efforts to get some Taliban leaders off the UN Resolution 1267 list, which was a list of terrorist suspects maintained by the UN Security Council since 1999. The Taliban have also tried to reassure Afghanistan's neighboring countries that they will not host groups that are hostile to them. In an Eid message on November 15, 2010, Mullah Omar said his group has a comprehensive policy for the efficiency of the future government of Afghanistan, about true security, Islamic justice, education, economic progress, national unity, and a foreign policy to convince the world that the future Afghanistan will not harm them. In his Eid message a year later, In August 2011, after secret talks had begun with the Americans, Mullah Omar admitted for the first time that talks were going on. He said that in the interest of a peaceful Afghanistan, every legitimate option can be considered in order to reach this goal. And he accepted that all ethnic groups will have participation in governing Afghanistan, a clear message to non-Pashtuns. The Taliban are exhausted by the long war. They have suffered terrible casualties, and they want to return home from the refugee camps in Pakistan. Moreover, they want to break free from Pakistan and the control exercised by the ISI, which they now intensely dislike. I will deal with this complex relationship in Chapter 8. The older generation of Taliban realize that since they could not run the country in the 1990s, they will not be able to do so in the future. Rather than trying to grab power and then face international isolation and forfeit funds and aid, they now see the benefits of a coalition government with Karzai that would retain Western aid, legitimacy, and support. The second round of talks with the Taliban took place in Doha, the capital of Qatar, on February 15, 2011. It was delayed due to the tragic death of Richard Holbrooke on December 13, 2010. The American officials, still highly mistrustful, asked Agha to prove that he had access to Mullah Omar and other leaders by getting the Taliban to deliver on a confidence-building measure that they proposed. The Americans asked Agha to see that the Taliban officially put out a certain public statement in language that had been agreed upon. A few weeks later, the participants received the long-awaited confirmation, a Taliban statement containing the agreed language. Agha had delivered, confirming that he spoke on behalf of the Taliban leadership.